Of all the epic leaders of the 20th century, few were more celebrated or more despised than Fidel Castro. After nearly 50 years, Castro's bigger-than-life role on the world stage has ended. What will become of his communist revolution? Next on Great Decisions.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation. Great Decisions is produced in association with the University of Delaware.
It was 1958, and the American-backed government of Cuba was under siege. At 33 years old, a fiery Fidel Castro already had a mythic charisma and messianic zeal. On January 1st, 1959, Castro and his fledgling band of revolutionary Fidelistas took control. Over the next 5 decades, the 90 miles between Florida and Castro's island marked a vast ideological divide. Cuba became a place where doctors, farm workers, and janitors all made do with a modest state salary, where food, houses, jobs, and free speech were strictly rationed, where Americans were regarded as enemy imperialists and political dissent was punished severely. Castro's revolution would face many challenges. He embarrassed the U.S. at the Bay of Pigs, he starred in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but discovered he was just a pawn of the Kremlin. He survived the fall of the Soviet Empire, but the failure of his socialist economy, the collapse of the USSR, and decades of U.S. sanctions left Cuba fragile and politically isolated. On February 24, 2008, his health failing and his nation plagued by chronic food shortages, Fidel Castro gave up power to his brother, Raul.
The revolution, in a sense, dies with Castro when he does, because there's no one who has the charisma or the international standing to move it forward.
Raul is reported to be a political pragmatist. He's already pledged to jumpstart the island's lethargic economy and relax his brother's socialist orthodoxy.
Raul Castro has often sounded in his speeches, which are much more brief than those of Fidel, a bit like Margaret Thatcher, emphasizing productivity, efficiency, the possibility that markets can actually deliver where the state cannot.
He's also put an end to the regime's long-standing bans on consumer spending. Cuban citizens can now openly purchase cell phones and computers, take taxis, even stay the night in luxury hotels frequented by foreign tourists, if they can afford it. Today, the average Cuban's standard of living is lower than it was after the Soviet collapse. Cuba after Castro, coming up next on Great Decisions.
And now from our studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
Welcome to Great Decisions. I'm Ralph Begleiter. Joining us to discuss the future of Cuba are Sarah Stevens, Executive Director of the Center for Democracy in the Americas and a longtime advocate of human rights issues in Hollywood and later in Washington, and Mauricio Claver Caron of the U.S.-Cuba Democracy Political Action Committee. Thanks to both of you for being with us.
Thank you.
Cuba's really kind of a fascinating place in the sense that for 60 years it's pretty much stayed the same under Fidel Castro. But now there's been a change. What's different about Cuba today, or is it different today than it was in the 1960s? Sarah?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think that a lot of Americans believe that Cuba has sort of been stuck in this time warp for the last 60 years, and it's, symbolized by these old American automobiles that are still, being driven around the streets of Havana. But actually, I think a lot has changed in Cuba, and what we forget is that the United States, because of our embargo, has not been engaged with Cuba, but the rest of the world has. And tourists, visitors, people from all over the world have been in Cuba, have been involved with Cubans, have been doing business on Cuba, and that this has changed reality on the island. I think obviously that a lot has stayed the same, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. But politically and economically, just in the last year, with Raul being the new president, there have begun to be actual structural changes.
Mauricio, do you think things have changed or stayed pretty much the same in Cuba?
I think, unfortunately, Cuba today still remains one of the handful of totalitarian states in the world alongside Burma and North Korea. That's a shame and that's an embarrassment. The world has changed, in which we've seen the end of the Soviet bloc. We've seen freedom sprout in many different places around the world. But the Cuban regime is stuck in a time warp. What has changed, and I think is very interesting, and something that they can't control, is that you have a whole new generation of Cubans on the island that are anxious for freedom, are anxious for change. And they've created an entire civil society which resembles that of Eastern Europe back in the late 70s and throughout the 80s. That civil society spans from independent libraries to independent labor unions to independent political parties. And it's really a bottom-up change that is going to force the regime, and it's already in rhetoric, although not in reality, starting to force them to consider certain things.
Great Decisions actually spoke with some other experts also about these pressures on Raul Castro to change Cuba from what it used to be. Let's hear what they have to say.
In the year or so between the time of Fidel Castro's illness and the assumption of power formally by Raul, the Cuban government undertook sort of a massive pulse-taking, public opinion-gathering exercise. And one of the things that the Cuban people registered very, very heavily was their anger at some of the restrictions that have been imposed on them for years.
There's a lot of pressure in Cuba for better living standards for people to be able to make money, to keep money, to spend money, for better housing, for better diet. And Raul Castro is responding to that. These are all steps that the Cuban people welcome, but they look to go beyond that. And the big question will be to the extent that Raul Castro is going to broaden the scope of these economic reforms. At the same time, he's very unlikely to make any kind of changes in the political structure.
Many of the reforms that Raul's put in place are more of a form of a reform than an actual deep reform.
Let's talk for a minute. Everybody's been talking about Raul Castro, but I think a lot of people don't know who he is. Who is Raul Castro other than Fidel's brother? Is he a clone of Fidel? Is he going to do things differently? Mauricio?
I think it's an interesting question. Just by what the media says and what the specialists that you had mentioned, you would think he's some type of economic guru or some type of economic reformer. But in reality, Raul, under the shadow of Fidel, has always been the political enforcer of the Cuban regime. In the 80s, for example, when the trial of General Ochoa in 1989, who was accused of narco-trafficking, but it was really seen as almost a political sedition trial, and Tony de la Guardia and other officials, it was Raul Castro and the current Minister of the Interior, General Colomé Ibarra, who led that investigation, who led all the tapping, who really led that purging of the Cuban regime, and at that time acquired the power of the Ministry of the Interior together with the Ministry of the Armed Forces. That's the type of person and personality that Raul has always been, someone that really has been obsessed with power, and I think that obsession continues to show to this day.
Sarah, how about you? Do you see Raul as someone who is as involved in the past and will continue to be that way in the future?
Well, I've never met him, so my opinions come from others. But my impression from Cubans that I talk to when I'm in Cuba is that he is, more than anything else, a pragmatist. He's a practical guy. He's a military guy. He wants to get things done efficiently and quickly and thoroughly. And I think that what he's done so far in terms of the reforms, the economic reforms, has shown that is who he is, and that's what he's trying to do.
What has he done so far?
Well, I think the most important, well, there are several important reforms, and they're just starting. It's not like, there's a long way to go, and people absolutely are not happy with where things are right now. They want more. But what Raul Castro has done is in the agricultural sector, most importantly. It's a sector that was always centralized with the Ministry of Agriculture in Havana. You couldn't get seeds or fertilizer or tools without asking for it from Havana. He's decentralized that. You can now decide for yourself what materials you need to farm and do it at the local level. The government has has turned over uncultivated lands, idle lands, to cooperatives and individual farmers who can produce on those lands. This has never happened before, and it's practical. They need to produce more food. They import the majority of their food to this day.
What about in the arena of civil rights and human rights for the people of Cuba? Have we seen any changes in that regard?
Some changes under Raul. Nothing like what we'd like to see, of course, and what the international human rights community would like to see. But Raul, in conversations, quiet conversations with some of the European countries, has ended up releasing a few of the political prisoners that are being held now. Now they are released and immediately leave the country and go to Spain. I don't know if that was part of the arrangement or not. Obviously it's not ideal, but I do think that it's a good model for us, and that the United States should be in there having the same conversations with the Cuban government and working toward more releases for more political prisoners.
Mauricio, do you see changes taking place for people in dealing with their personal rights, their human rights, their civil rights, that sort of thing?
I think the Cuban government has always used the Cuban people as hostages and as tools of negotiation. They are pragmatists. I agree with Sarah in the sense that they've always been pragmatists. Fidel was a pragmatist in the sense of, he never really stuck to an ideology. He used ideology when he needed to control power, when he needed to increase repression, etc. Nonetheless, they've always, maintained and kept the Cuban people in a hostage situation and have released prisoners for some type of concession from a European country, for some high-level visitor, and then they go and they rearrest. The one thing that we are seeing that is a little bit different, and it involves the level of energy amongst the young people. The one thing you have to recall, though, is, Fidel Castro handed over power, per se, to his brother Raul, although most people still believe that Fidel Castro is in control. There's 3 titles in Cuba: head of the Council of State, head of the Council of Ministers, and head of the Cuban Communist Party. There's been a title change here. Raul is now head of the Council of State and head of the Council of Ministers, but Fidel is still head of the Communist Party, which is the most important position. So Fidel is, by all means, still in control. Raul's successor now, so he went from an 81-year-old to a 76-year-old to Raul's successor now is Machado Ventura, who is 78 years old. And yet you have the majority of the island are young people that are pushing for change. So the one thing that you are seeing amongst the populace is that the repression, they cannot afford to martyr anyone. If they have a martyr, if they have a figure that and Fidel had them from before, but since Fidel's personality was more grandiose, it was, he could always kind of hide them. Nonetheless, today, you have a hit-and-run repression. You have young people that go out, they do a vigil, they do a sit-in, they beat them up, they put them in jail for a few days, they release them. A couple of years ago, you had lots of young people began this whole cambio movement, this whole change movement. They started wearing these white bands that said cambio. They arrested hundreds of them, beat them up a bit, and released them in a couple of days. What they're trying to do now is a battle of these older guys trying to tire out the younger people and scare them out of their activities.
Both of you have hinted at the idea that the United States could influence the future of Cuba in one way or another. Sarah, you suggested the U.S. might engage in negotiations in the way that the Europeans have done, and Mauricio, you talked about applying more pressure to the current government. Let's listen to what some of our other great decisions experts have to say about U.S. involvement with Cuba.
The reform process in Cuba is going to go at its own pace, and Raul Castro will not frame it as a search for a way to engage the United States. The Cuban government will not be seen as explicitly making any concessions in terms of its reforms on the economic front or the political front in order to get access to the U.S. market, because it's not its priority any longer. Having said that, there's a lot of trade and exchange on the cultural level, diplomatic level, in terms of basic security interests that both countries have that do merit deeper engagement.
If you really want to see change in Cuba, I think we have to look to when they and we in the United States open up and allow more information about what a better life for Cubans looks like.
The goal always has to be to promote democratic change in Cuba. What can the United States do to promote this? And one can easily argue that seeking engagement with the Raul Castro government may open up avenues of possible improvement That may not happen, but there's really nothing to be lost in attempting to seek new measures to engage the government of Cuba.
Mauricio, is there really nothing to be lost by seeking to engage the government of Cuba at this point?
Cubans have a saying, and basically that they're allowed to vote, but the only way they can vote is with their feet. If you tomorrow allowed and told every Cuban, whoever wants to leave the island and come to the United States can do so, you pretty much have an empty island. The reality with that is that, contrary to what some of these speakers said, Cubans know that life is better in the United States. Cuban knows the freedoms, political, social, and economic freedoms that they have here. Cubans want that better life. The only thing that's keeping them from that is the Cuban government. As I mentioned before, if you're seeing today, the one thing that is changing is that bottoms-up approach with the civil society, sort of like the Charter 77 movement in the former Czechoslovakia, and the Solidarity in Poland, etc., which was a bottoms-up movement from the people up without any particular type of leadership. If you cut that off by going to the top and trying to bring change from the top down, you cut off that thriving, kind of democracy in a bubble that those people are trying to execute. And that's a reality. Current U.S. policy is very simple. Current U.S. policy basically conditions our engagement politically and economically with the Cuban dictatorship to three conditions, essentially. The freedom of all Cuban political prisoners, the recognition of fundamental human rights, and the legalization of the opposition parties. You're not asking for much.
Sarah, the U.S. policy pretty much hasn't changed in 50 years. Should it change?
Well, it's failed. The Cuban government, the Castro government, has outlived 10 American presidents. The Council on Foreign Relations, Julia's organization, reported this year that U.S.-Cuba policy has accomplished nothing. It hurts our image internationally. It leaves us out of step with Europe, with Israel, China, the rest of Latin America. I think the embargo harms American jobs and our constitutional rights. I believe that we should lift restrictions on travel and trade, and there should be absolutely no restrictions. But that's not just my view, it's also the view of over 60% of the American people. And most important, and this is where I really differ actually with Mauricio, the Cuban people want to determine their own future. I've been there over 30 times. I've talked to many, many Cubans, and if there's one thing I've heard over and over again, it's that they don't want Miami determining their future, and they don't want Washington determining their future. They want to be the ones in the driver's seat.
Why hasn't U.S. policy changed? Is it a domestic political issue, a group of Cuban Americans in New York, New Jersey, and Florida?
Well, that's a good question.
Sarah, question to you.
It's a very good question. Yes, I think a big reason is that it's a domestic political issue for us.
You think that's true, Mauricio?
But your question makes an assumption. I mean, U.S. policy towards Cuba has changed over the last 50 years. It hasn't been a static policy. Until 1992, travel was practically not regulated to Cuba. People were able to travel in and out. It was after 1992 that the categories of travel for certain purposeful humanitarian reasons, et cetera, was brought about because of the Cuban government creating a system of tourism apartheid, et cetera, and seeking hard currency to survive through the 90s. Well, they ended up getting that from Europe and Latin America and created a horrible segregation system in the tourism industry that owned and financed by the Cuban military. I mean, and the United States did not want to partake in that. Since 2000, you've been able to sell food and medicine to Cuba, agricultural products and medical products to Cuba. Before 1992, you were basically able to have trade and commerce on everything through third country subsidiaries. So it has changed, and it hasn't been a static policy, but it's always sought to do basically two things, ways to support the Cuban civil society, but not finance the existence of the Cuban regime.
Looking to the future, we talked with our other experts as well about what they imagine happening in the next few years, and particularly about whether there are any trends underway that would lead to loosening of the authoritarian government's control in Havana. Let's listen.
There's a lot of pressure to keep the authoritarian regime in place from within the armed forces, the security apparatus, the Communist Party. There's overwhelming power in the hands of Raul Castro. This is going to be the key factor. One would expect that there will be a new generation of leaders who will begin to exercise even greater power in Cuba after Raul Castro passes on. Then the question is, are they going to be old Fidelista types? Are they going to be more open to change?
When Raul Castro, perhaps after his 5-year term that he's in the middle of serving right now, is no longer president, however that should transpire, I think we'll see a further continuity of the individuals now around Raul. We might see a younger generation begin to come into the Council of State, to the Politburo. Already the Communist Party and the National Assembly are populated by substantially younger people than they have been in the past. So I don't anticipate an abrupt rupture with what we've seen over the last 50 years, even when Raul is gone.
Let me ask about Raul being gone, since several of those speakers talked about it. Do you think that Raul Castro will relinquish his power at the end of his 5-year term, or do you think we're going to be looking at another leader who will attempt to remain in power? Mauricio?
I think after 50 years of the Castro brothers, their obsession with power and their obsession with their inner circle is well documented. Almost the absurdity here, and even in listening to commentaries and this whole debate is that, I mean, the solution to this could be very simple. You know, we don't want the United States or Miami to decide the future of Cuba. We want the Cuban people to decide the future of Cuba. And that's a very simple process. Allow them, open up this small clique of, a handful of individuals, step aside, and let the Cubans vote, and let the Cubans participate, and let the Cubans choose their representation, their leadership. And this is all over. This debate is over. What hand should the U.S. have in that, though? Well, the U.S. should insist and should basically maintain. It's basically like if you have a store, that's owned by the mafia. You have two choices. You can do business with the mafia, or you can say, stop, blackmailing the people and open up. We do not need to be doing. If our leverage is through our business, through our tourism, through the money, through the investment that will be brought to Cuba, I think that it's the Cuban people that deserve that, not this 5 or 6 individuals that are controlling and obsessed with power.
Sarah, do you think Raul Castro will relinquish power after 5 years? Has that corner been turned in Cuba?
The Cubans want to save the revolution. They want to keep the achievements, which they are very, very proud of, and not just the Cuban government, but Cubans themselves are very proud of their healthcare system. They're very proud of their educational system. They're very proud of the fact that there are Cuban doctors all over the world taking care of people in need. I think he absolutely isn't going to go away, and the Cuban government isn't going to go away. I mean, I agree with what some of the Julia Zweig and others said. There are hopefully some new people with new experiences from a different generation who are going to modify how the government behaves and what it does. But I don't anticipate any kind of dramatic end or change in Cuba.
Great Decisions has been covering this Cuba issue for quite a number of years, of course, because it's been going on for a very long time. Mauricio, you'll have the final word. Look ahead, 10 years. Will we be having this conversation 10 years from now? Absolutely not. I'm an optimist, and knowing my generation, I'm going to label myself young here, knowing my generation and seeing what they're doing on the island, the civil society, how it's grown. There's not an Eastern European that I talk to that hasn't gone to the island and tells me, everything is in place. This is where we were in 87, in 88. It's a bottoms-up approach. You have these young people, Jorge Luis Garcia Antunes, in Placetas, who is basically, he's 40 years old, has spent 20 years almost in prison, half of his life, and yet he still goes out there, young Afro-Cuban leader, every day, testing the limits. Gets beat up, put back in prison, but every day, those young people, this old regime cannot keep down. And those are the future leaders of Cuba. And those are the future democratic leaders of Cuba, because they're trying, within this bubble of repression, are trying to practice democracy amongst themselves. It's very difficult because, unfortunately, it remains one of the totalitarian states, but it's not going to be that. And those young individuals like Antunes are going to be the future leaders of Cuba. And one day, we're going to have friendly relations, and we're going to be able to sit here and talk about this 50-year period and talk about, what lessons were learned from that, so that hopefully, Cuba never has to undertake any dictatorship
whether this 50-year one or the previous one, or of the left or the right, of anything, so that Cuba can be a regular democratic country and that people can use their entrepreneurial talents, etc.
Mauricio Claver Caron, director of the U.S.-Cuba Political Action Committee in Washington, and a former Treasury Department official, and Sarah Stevens, executive director of the Center for Democracy in the Americas. Thank you both for being with us on Great Decisions. And thank you as well for joining us on the program. We'll see you next time. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.tv. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation. Great Decisions is produced in association with the University of Delaware.
Next time on Great Decisions. There are few more dangerous places in the world than the lawless border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan. What can the U.S. and its allies do to tame the warlords, jihadis, and Taliban factions who operate there? Next time on Great Decisions.